Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Paul Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. This is one of 3 episodes dedicated to the celebration of the 125th anniversary of Drexel University. Each episode will be devoted to a term inscribed on the Drexel University insignia: art, science, industry. The current episode is devoted to art, and we are pleased to have 2 guests with us today: Klaus Krippendorff, Gregory Bateson Professor Emeritus of Cybernetics, Language, and Culture at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, and David Raizman, a distinguished university professor of art history and design in Drexel's Westfall College of Media Arts and Design. Both of our guests have written important books on design. Dr. Raizman's History of Modern Design is now in its 2nd edition, and Dr. Krippendorff's book, The Semantic Turn, A New Foundation for Design, is a classic in its field. Klaus Krippendorff and David Raizman, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thank you for inviting us.
Well, you come from design, both of you, from different directions. Klaus, you come from engineering and communication, at least your original training.
Actually, my original training was at the Ulm School of Design in Germany. And I'm a graduated designer.
And then David comes out of art history, which is another feeder into design. And I wonder what you think about your backgrounds in terms of how that has influenced the way you see design. And I'll start with Klaus.
Well, as I was saying, I was a graduated designer, and as such, I came to the United States, and I couldn't find anyone interested in the kind of things that I was exposed to in this avant-garde school in Ulm. And then
That's in Germany.
In Germany. Then I found an interdisciplinary program at the University of Illinois in communication, and there were cyberneticians and there were designers. And I graduated as with a communication degree. And then I worked for a long time in communication. But my friends in design, they always said, you have to come back. So in 1984, in fact, I was in constant contact with these friends. They invited me to Ohio State and give lectures on the combination of communication and design. And then in 1984, we started the idea of product semantics. So, and I'm walking both paths.
Communication and design, and you've done work in content analysis.
Yes, that is kind of
so
my
I would like to get more into the communication piece as it relates to design, but let's hear this other side, which is art history, strikes me as a complement of sorts to the direction from which you came. David, tell me about that.
Well, I came to Drexel in 1989 as a department head in a department in the college, which is now the Westfall College, that was called Fashion and Visual Studies. My background was in art history. I studied the history of medieval art in Spain. And although I had taught a range of survey courses in the history of art and felt comfortable teaching any period, there was a course on the books at Drexel called The History of Modern Design. And I elected to teach it because I was interested in the subject. And I always had this feeling teaching the history of modern art that when I talked about products and objects, graphic design, posters, interiors, a little bit of fashion, I always felt the students' ears perked up, that suddenly they were talking about things that they had a direct contact with rather than things that they were familiar with only hanging on the walls of museums. When students would remark in their student evaluations that they liked the course but there was no materials to study from, I decided to start writing a book on it. And lo and behold, unlike the academic market for scholarship, many publishers were interested in such a book. And you know, it's become quite successful. I probably would write it differently if I were to write it today, but design history has become a field allied with art history, but also separate in a way. And I guess as a lead-in, why I became interested in when I read the Semantic Turn and learned that Klaus was my neighbor over here at the University of Pennsylvania. It was because he wasn't talking about design so much as an offshoot of the history of art, but thinking of it in terms of communication, in terms not so much the role of the designer, but the role of the user, issues of collaboration, issues of interdisciplinarity that seem to me to differentiate design history from art history, but at the same time kind of establish its identity in a really vital and vibrant way.
Yeah, no, the Semantic Turn is a profound book in that it encompasses so much, and in a way you can say design encompasses so much. But I want to ask you this question about, Drexel is very much, we've discussed this with the engineers who we interviewed as well. It has a real link of theory and practice. The applied aspect of knowledge is very important. And I wonder about design as a form of applied art, maybe one of the consummate examples of applied art. And whether you feel this is true, is it true that you can't dissociate design from function in the way you can fine art, which can exist in and of itself? Would you say that that is a true definition?
Well, I wouldn't start saying that design is, although many people agree with that, is applied art. I think design has something to do with culture.
Yeah.
And with technology, or the role of technology in culture. And design is, to me, an amazing profession, changing actually culture through the means of technology. So for me, I think that it's a very practical field. And yes, many designers come actually from art, but this is not.
It's too narrow a way to think.
This would be too narrow. And when you say applied art, I would say this is really a separate issue, as you say, that it stands on its own. But design doesn't stand on art per se, but it stands on technology, culture, users, sociology, and that is, I think, the defining...
That interdisciplinary, that integrated nature of it. I want to ask you about the design schools that have existed, because many of us who think about design think in terms of arts and crafts, Bauhaus, Scandinavian design, the Ulm School of Design, which you are very intimately associated with. And these schools are linked to points in time. And I wonder about your feelings about them. How relevant are they still? How important are they in design, in both the history of design and design now? And David, I wonder if you've written the history of design.
I mean, I think all students appreciate to a certain degree, learning about some of the major, say, canonical institutions or movements that are associated with the history of design. And they don't, they have relevance because there are elements of them that continue to be relevant. I mean, the arts and crafts movement is over a century of old. Its initial relationship with William Morris was part of his socialist politics, and really was intended to be part of a worker revolution. But the idea that we enjoy doing things with our hands, and that we take pride in that, and we derive some satisfaction and joy out of it, this is something that doesn't go away. I mean, the success of Home Depot is, in a sense, based upon it. I think with these movements, it's important to recognize that they emerged at a particular time and under particular circumstances. But there's usually a kernel there that transcends their historical contingency and becomes something that students can relate to, and that I think designers can relate to as well.
I want to add that what is impressive to me is all of these schools, they had actually social missions. The arts and crafts that you mentioned, even though it failed, but it is just not possible to do everything by hand. But there was a social mission behind it. The Bauhaus too. They realized that products are mass-produced, and why not making them available to everyone? And that fed, of course, in the issue of the industry. And the Ulm School was a very combination of, after the war, to rejuvenate actually design in Germany and changing the whole perspective. And to me, I think the Ulm School had also a social mission, the functional design and introducing science in design.
Well, I think it's interesting that Klaus made the point that each of these movements did not succeed. And I want to then link this to the definition that some writers have given of design as creative problem solving, or better yet, the creation of a preferred situation out of an existing situation. And it would seem to me that none of these movements can succeed because the existing situation has to there's always a preferred situation to what exists. So this suggests a kind of evolutionary, progressive nature to design, that it can never stay put. It can never be realized, so to speak, in the utopic terms that a William Morris or a Corbusier or whatever might have had in mind. Would you say that's true?
That's absolutely true. And I'm actually taking it from a slightly different perspective, but coming to the same, namely, technological forecasts are notoriously wrong. Why are they wrong? Because of the effects of designers who constantly change things and produce something new. So I think, to me, design is kind of the major renovators, or they keep actually a culture alive by constantly changing, introducing new things. And I think that is the hidden mission of design. And you mentioned creative problem solving, and you cited actually Herbert Simon's definition, and I can say more about this, but the idea is actually, I wouldn't say changing an existing situation to a preferred one, but inventing new situations that are livable.
But are problem solving? Because again, this creative problem solving idea, it would seem to me that as the world progresses or changes, or we learn more about what we need, the problems change. So we have issues of ecology and sustainability and health and cost and so forth. They seem to have proliferated now and are all taken into account in design solutions that were not necessarily taken into account before. Yeah. So that drives the changes too.
Let me say something about problems. Problems are usually given by someone to a designer. Historically, designers were hired by an industry and said, we have that problem and you solve it. Mm-hmm. I think design has always moved out of that. In fact, in creating problems or creating new situations is far more important than solving the problems that some institutions also defines. And I'm a little opposed to Herbert Simon's notion, because he comes actually from computer science engineering, and there's usually a problem is well defined. Some people call it a tame problem as opposed to a wicked problem. Wicked problems
a wicked problem?
Wicked problem.
I love that.
Horst Rittel wrote about this and saying basically, when there are human beings involved, human beings don't necessarily solve problems, rather they have desires. And that is a totally different kind of mindset within which I think design ought to move. And now it is once things are solved, once things are boiled down to really the nitty-gritties, then one can talk about problem solving. But the issue is actually to define the problem.
But see, what you're saying here strikes me as very provocative, because here's where art and design really come together. If we're not thinking about simple functionality as the problem, how will it function best, but thinking about human desire and human surprise and comfort and other sorts of things, we do merge into elements that are not necessarily practical, right? So much of design now, people will look at certain chairs and certain sorts of designed elements, and they'll say, that makes no sense, or that's not comfortable, or that's ugly. And I think that's moving into the realm that we associate with abstract art, for example. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how you would differentiate.
Well, but when you say earlier about art, would you say artists solve problems?
Yes.
Oh, that is surprising to me. I
No,
would
you're
say,
absolutely right. Well, I
I
guess
would
that's
say
what-
they
yeah.
don't.
Well, they do solve problems. They have to solve where to put the color. They
Oh
have
yeah,
to,
but that is
what I mean.
after they have invented something, want to do something that has never been done before, and then yes, after that is settled, then there are problems to be solved. Doesn't mean that the paint stays on like.
Well, but it depends on how
this
you
is mine.
define a problem. You define a problem as trying to create a visually, whether it's shocking, surprising, appealing, that's the problem. So it's semantic.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, a problem is really one that defines a space, a design space within which there are many, many solutions, and Herbert Simon is a master in this. And then one has an optimizing function, and one looks which one is best, and that's one proposes as a solution. But it requires always a confinement by the definition of a problem. And I think designers ought to think beyond that.
I was just at the Cooper Hewitt on Saturday in New York, where they have, after 3 years of being closed for renovations, they've reopened. They reinitiated their design triennials. And I think that anybody that wants to come at design from the standpoint of discovery and invention and originality and the creative use of materials and all of these things would be very happy in that exhibition. All the designs are named by individuals. Not all of them were made for manufacturers. They don't really involve consumers except for extremely high-end ones. And again, it fits that paradigm. So both as an engine of creativity and as an engine of economic productivity globally, it's still a satisfying paradigm. But I do feel that design goes beyond it. And the one reason that I like Simon's definition, despite, and I would agree with Klaus, who knows it better than me, but that the one thing I always liked about it was that it suggested that design doesn't necessarily have to be an object. That a preferred situation could mean that choosing your wardrobe in the morning is an act of design. It's a product of self-transformation and identity making. So that expands the field of how to think about design and of what is design.
Well, I think it connects to communication.
Yes, exactly.
And that's it. And maybe the user-centered or the human-centered aspect of design is communication-based, whereas a work of art, as you seem to say, I mean, it is in a way meant to communicate, but it can exist in itself.
It's also communication.
It is also.
You have to look at it, you talk about it,
right.
And it becomes important because things are explained or evident, and so. No, I think communication is involved, but I think that you mentioned, actually, there are two things that I want to say. One is the issue of transformation. I think design good design has to be transformative. Not just adding some color to something, but changing.
Can you give me an example of a transformative design?
Yes, think about the personal computer. When I came actually to the University of Pennsylvania, I learned computer programming and crunching numbers. And there was the crazy people in California who said everyone should have a computer. That was totally incomprehensible for most people. And indeed, it didn't make any sense. It solved no problem. No? But they had a mission. They had an idea and made it possible. And now I think that has been transforming society in ways that we still don't completely understand.
But here, let me ask you a question. So the personal computer as a technology has been transformative, but you're saying it's also a design element. Is it Apple that did it? Was it Apple that was able to bridge that gap between the technological and the communication?
That's the issue of communication or the user-centered. The computer, we had these computers always. I mean, at that time, there was no great technological invention. Things became smaller, yes, and more portable. But the point was actually the interface with people.
Yes.
Without an interface, it would have been impossible. As I said, I learned to program Fortran 4 Very few people could do that, and it would not have been possible for everyone to learn Fortran and then not really knowing what to do with these numbers. Now we don't need that. So it is actually an innovation in the way we interact with technology. So that has transformed society, the way we interact with each other, not always to the better, but I think by and large, if it wouldn't be improving something, it wouldn't have been adopted. So I think good design is transformative in the domain of culture, social interaction, communication, and that is to me...
Well, that's a wonderful example. I wonder if we could end by your giving us an example of bad design or failed design, something where a design was done that you feel did not realize its potential and an opportunity was lost.
Well,
that's hard.
Luckily,
yeah.
Bad designs just don't make it. And so we don't recognize them so easily. But actually, I'm on a PhD design list, and there someone said, but 95% of all designs that are somehow made don't make it. And that has to do with from students that design something and nobody's interested in it. There's much to be learned from failures. And I think this is, I wish we could talk more about this, the issue of education and the mission of Drexel University or any design department. There's a completely different kind of environment in which we exist. And that means also not just to design something and say, here it is, and make a sketch, but also to consider what happens to that design, how it travels through the stakeholder networks, how it comes to users, how it is changing the environment, and the whole issue of ecology. You mentioned earlier Gregory Bateson. I think these are the kind of issues that are increasingly important for any design school, and that needs to be taught in a very different way than before, where it is actually more art, and that's something I think we should probably really change.
So is there a school of design or a design conception right now that you feel is particularly exciting? A movement, a school?
Well, I think, I mean, not a particular school, but there are lots of very good people that discuss these systems thinking in design, that one doesn't think about a product rather than not a system of product, but the system within which products can survive, on the whole notion of culture, the ethnographic approach that is increasingly important to just get a sense of what would possibly be a contribution to particular ways of living.
I was just thinking about bad design for a minute. There's really I think there's sort of two ways to approach it. There was concerted efforts from the middle of the 19th century onward to determine standards of design that were really solely based upon taste. Where it really was an issue of taste formation, where design was going to be something that could unify a culture and a society. In other words, the idea being that if people from different social classes all believed that beauty was a certain thing, that it would serve to create a more coherent and less conflictually based society. Most of these efforts failed miserably because they simply don't work in a free market economy. You can't control what people will like if manufacturers are willing to make them and if there's a market for them. The other way of thinking about bad design is sort of like Donald Norman talking about the design of everyday things, where he just talks about the maddening nature of electronic devices that either don't function properly or have such a poor user interface that they become frustrating rather than transformative or even easy.
Well, there is also another issue that which is, I think, important. When I went to the design school, there was an effort to create a unified notion of aesthetics. There were different schools having different, but there was one aesthetics is for all. But this has been completely transformed through markets, to recognition of of different social groups, and for me, more important, of different cultures. In the 1950s, there were underdeveloped countries and there were technologically developed countries. Now we realize that they are not just developing, they have their own culture. And we have to recognize that, for example, I was in India not so long ago, there are very different kinds of ways of handling things and different kind of interfaces, and there has to be an acknowledgement of the cultural basis in which technology is planted, and then one can indeed design things, but has to be very different in different cultures. So this is kind of again a broadening of the scope of design in recognizing not just the individual users, but the whole culture within which something is to succeed.
Well, I think that gives us a very good, broad viewpoint from which to end this fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk about design in its smallest and its largest sense. Klaus Krippendorff and David Raizman, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure, Paula. Thank you.
And thank you for being here today at the Drexel Interview.